Hello and welcome to the Being and Becoming podcast. Together, we are being honest in conversations about thoughts we're having and books we're reading in the hopes of becoming better, more able versions of our current selves. My name is Logan Hauer. I'm joined today by my regular guest and co-host, Patrick Dyer. Pat, how are you doing today, buddy?
Excellent. Hello, everybody.
So we have a little night session recording going on here. And, Patrick and I were catching up before the call, and I wanted to touch on a subject that Patrick and I had delved into in quite great detail last time we had a podcast together, which was called Blue Zones, for any listener that wants to go check that out. But Pat, I kind of wanted to turn it over to you here first, just so you could kind of reiterate what blue zones are and maybe highlight kind of what we were talking about on that last episode.
So, a quick summary: what we're talking about. Blue zones. These are areas of the world that usually have a nice, rich climate, rich social interactions. The people there live exceptionally long lives. We're talking like 80 plus years and healthy 80 plus years. Low disease, whole foods, things like that. I think some of the videos I've watched recently, I think there was a few in Costa Rica. There's one in Japan, Okinawa, Japan. I think Italy has a few. And then my brother was telling me Naples, Florida, in the United States, obviously, is on its way to potentially becoming one. So that's pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. And
Only
I
one in the States that I know of. I haven't Googled that yet, but
and I remember last time part of our conversation was how much of this blue zone is tied to physical place, being in a tropic or subtropic climate, having nice weather, a lot of sunshine, things of that nature. But I also heard you mention Costa Rica, and I have to shout out the Urbans if they're listening, because they're moving there next month. Or when does this air? Yeah, it will be a couple weeks after this airs. So shout out to the Urbans if they're listening. But yeah, no, I think the challenge that you had posed in that last episode, I really took to heart, which was, so there's this physical place called a blue zone, and there are these characteristics, longevity, quality of life that are kind of associated to it. But then there's also kind of this communal aspect to it as well. Or like maybe it's communal, but it's also like a bit of like carefree. I think we're kind of talking about, or it's like we're not super stressed. We live in the moment and that sort of thing. And you had posed the question to me last time, which I wanted to follow up on this conversation, which was, can we try to manifest that idea essentially in our lives? Although like we only have so much control over the physical place that we occupy or that we live in, but how can we maybe take some of these concepts and apply them to our lives, as far as like having behaviors and cultivating routines that will provide us a better quality of life. And I think like I've been able to have a lot of great social interactions with people in the city, through my church and through work. And then I had my sister in town, got dinner with some friends recently, which was really fun. So it feels like I'm kind of stepping into that a little bit since our conversation. And I think I'm just more mindful of it too. And I think grateful. So I wanted to call that out on this episode, because I think there are some times where me or us, whatever, are talking about something and it's like, oh, that's a great idea, that's a great concept. But I do want the listener to know, as well as Patrick, that I'm trying to cultivate this more regularly into my routine or my life. And I would also like to get in the gym more, which I think Pat has been so good at for so many years, as far as making that a routine. But I've been continuing with my once a week, just kind of like a steady schedule or whatnot of going to the gym. But I think I could even raise that another day. I was talking with Peyton this week, my wife Peyton, about maybe going another day or two to the gym, because I just feel so much better now. If I don't go, I don't think I could go a week without going to the gym. So I think that's a good that's good progress, but I also see the opportunity for there to be more of that into my daily life or routine. So yeah, just wanted to share that with you, Pat, but then also wanted to see if you had any comments on anything I just shared, or how the blue zone conversation has been affecting you since last time.
Definitely want to hone in on your mindfulness comment. That definitely probably is the main focus of your perspective. You've just really recognized what you can and can't do within your given environment, and you're just making the most of it. And that's amazing. Absolutely amazing. As simple as that is, it's probably the best way to live. Shoot.
I think one of my strengths is I know I'm bad at a lot of things. I know I'm good at about three or four, and I try to do those. And even like the working out thing, like I know that I haven't been disciplined or I will say this, I haven't valued it, because that's probably the right way to say it. I have not valued it adequately, and then having my ACL injury has made me realize, oh, I need to start taking this a little bit more seriously, because now I wasn't really working out, running, eating right, doing all that stuff. I get hurt kind of by a fluke, but it's also like maybe there are some things I can control that are, you know, within my everyday life or in my practices that I could be, to your point, more mindful of, and that could improve my physical well-being, and longevity of life and quality of life and all that stuff. Um, so yeah, I think that those are good words, and thank you for your thoughts on that and whatnot, and for valuing my mindfulness. I appreciate that. So, um, but speaking of mindfulness, this is a there's this book that I've been reading, and it's a bit of a family heirloom. And any of the Howers out there listening, I think would be interested to kind of catch this story, Pat, if you don't mind me running it past you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was telling you before the call, I didn't want to kind of spoil anything for when we were recording, but my sister, when she was in town, had handed me the book. It's actually, I won't say the name because I maybe might do something with it later. I won't say it on the podcast. I'll tell you afterwards, though. But she gave me this book that this family member had written, and this family member basically lived a very interesting life. He was a priest within the Catholic Church. Um, his family had moved in Canada. His father murdered someone. They moved to the States. Then he becomes a missionary in Arizona, runs off with a housekeeper, eventually gets back to the church and kind of like brought back in. Of course, none of this gets brought up in the book. He focuses more on like his ministry, obviously, and like the culture of the people. But there was like one little hint of it. Like there is a couple like funny little writings that he'll have in there about like something like it'll be for God to judge or something like that. Because there was like speculation in the town about a woman that was his housekeeper, who I'm assuming is the one that he kind of like ran off with and whatnot. But like the townspeople were gossiping about her, and then he said something like, be between them and God, or me and God, or something like that. And I was like, oh, maybe he's talking about that in an indirect way. But it's funny, like most of the time he's like lamenting the fact that he's a missionary. Like he's a mortician basically. So the Navajo Indians that he was, or Native Americans, he calls them Indians because this was written 100 years ago, um, but he was servicing this group of people, and they didn't have much need for like a pastor, right? So he had to fill in these other roles that they needed in their community. So he was the medicine man. So anytime the children would get sick, he would like cure them or give them hydrogen peroxide for cuts and stuff like that. But then he would worry all night, like, did I kill them, or like, did I make, because he doesn't know stuff about medicine that much. Like, he's not a doctor or anything. And so he's like, did I hurt them or whatnot? And then 3 days later, they would come by and be like, oh, yeah, all the kids are better now. Like, can we get more of that medicine? And he'd be like relieved. And then he'd like make more of it and stuff. It was just really just like interesting to hear his account of kind of all the stuff that happened. And the Navajo Native Americans did not like touching the dead or like dealing with the dead at all, so they would call him, and he would have to carry the bodies to there was like a Christian cemetery by the church, And so at one point, I think he says this kind of jokingly, but that he buried half of the bodies that were like out in this little cemetery. So imagine being a missionary. It's like that's not what you signed up for, but that was just like what he had to do. And he also helped build a church and like get water irrigation to a town in New Mexico. So because I think he lived in kind of like the eastern Arizona, like east central Arizona, kind of uh, near the state line or whatever. So he also lived in Mexico for a little bit, or New Mexico rather. But yeah, just thought I'd kind of share. Sorry, I'm kind of rambling there. I didn't have a coherent thought on that necessarily, but just an interesting guy, and wasn't sure if you had any thoughts, Pat.
Shoot, none come to mind. He definitely just does sound really interesting. I was kind of trying to picture the movie in my head. It sounds like it could be good cinema.
Oh, there's something there. I think there's something there, but
That sure sounds like it.
yeah. So I'm actually heading to Cincinnati this weekend with Peyton, and so this will come out after that trip happens. So hopefully they'll maybe tune in and listen to this or whatnot. But some of the family, but yeah, I'm gonna kind of. I've been reading this book all week. It's only 85 pages, and so I'm going to finish it tonight or tomorrow, and then when I go back in town, kind of share it with everybody. So I'm looking
That'll
forward
be
to that.
fun. Yeah,
Yeah, just like
that'll be good.
my family really values storytelling and good stories, and spending quality time together. So I think that'll be fun. So
Yeah, that'll be
um,
dope.
yeah, but yeah, I just wanted to maybe see what else. Like that's kind of what I've been reading and doing. I feel like I've been talking a lot, Pat, but I'd love to turn it over to you and kind of get some of your like thoughts on what's going on. To the extent that you want to share, either that you're reading, thinking, being challenged by, any of the above.
Well, we can start it off with this. Just an hour ago, Chevy released the most powerful Corvette known to man. Brand new car released today. Just let this be a momentous occasion. Seeing as how Corvettes get brought up every other one, it
Yeah.
needed to be mentioned. It needed to be mentioned.
Yeah. For the listener too, let's bring them back in, Pat, because it's been an ongoing conversation on the podcast. But if maybe you're newer to the show, there's been this aspiration on Patrick's part, a dream, if you will, of one day owning a Corvette. So this is big news.
Very big, very big. It's the C8 ZR1, and it's probably gonna go for 500,000. I don't know. I haven't seen the price point yet, but it's just unbelievable already.
Jeez.
So, but other than that, let's see. What have I been reading lately? No books, unfortunately. I've been thinking of picking back up 12 Rules for Life, though. I'd like to get back into that, but scripturally, I've been reading a lot of Proverbs, as always, as you could have guessed.
Yeah.
And then, oh shoot, another thing actually. Are you familiar with the mythological creature called the satyrs?
I don't know if I am. You might have to refresh me.
All right, so it's mentioned the satyrs are mentioned a couple times in the Bible. It's mentioned in Isaiah, Chronicles, I believe, and then I think it's First Samuel 18-ish, somewhere around there. So there's two. There's the Druids. The Druids aren't mentioned in the Bible that I know of, but the satyrs are. So, and I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert. I'm just tapping into this. So I'll tell you what I've barely tapped into.
Yeah, please.
Very, very interesting. So satyrs are goat-like people. So uh it sounds like they can shapeshift maybe a little bit. Um they live in high rocky areas, look like goats. Maybe they are goats, but they can also kill, breed, make decisions, choices. They seem to be sentient. So it's very interesting that scripture mentions these creatures and they're not mentioned in a good realm. They're mentioned usually with death and destruction or chaos. and then the satyrs rejoice in the chaos. So I looked up a teeny bit about mythology, and satyrs are definitely a big character kind of in I don't know if it was Greek, it probably was. I'm sure everything was back then, or maybe it was Mesopotamian mythology or something, but Mr. Tumnus from Narnia is supposed to be like a depiction of a satyr.
See, that's what I was wondering, and I was going to ask because when you had described half man, half goat, I obviously, I was going to Mr. Tumnus because
Yeah.
we growing up, that was Chronicles of Narnia had come out when we were, kids or whatnot. So
But the reason this is so interesting to me, I can't remember if I mentioned this last time or not, but since I've been on the ICU for quite a while, I do a lot of precepting, which is really fun. I love to do it. So I precept a lot of new nurses, a lot of nursing students, nurse externs is what some of them are called as well.
and
So I
sorry,
have
what does precept mean?
I I teach them what to do, pretty much teach them the job, the ins and outs, what we're looking for, try to educate them as much as possible. Work with them until they're comfortable to do something on their own, and then I observe them doing it on their own and try to make corrections and or just guide them back to what we're doing and stuff like that. So I had um, this nursing student slash nurse extern with me, and thankfully, knock on wood, I'm always going to knock on wood for this. We did have a somewhat busy group of patients, but they were mostly intubated and sedated, and the doctors did not want them to be necessarily bothered too much. They just wanted them to rest. So we were in there chilling, big chilling. So she was with me for 2 shifts in a row. So that's 24 hours, and 15 probably ish hours of these 24 hours in 2 days were spent talking about her experiences with religion, mine with a religion, and then uh, she's also really big into psychedelics and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
And so, of course, I've shared my thoughts before on, I guess, their use or maybe, or what, how they could have influenced some things. I find it very fascinating that she's witnessed during the use of these drugs things like satyrs and druids and even crazy things like Medusa and really odd things. And I'm not gonna I count those things as probably there. I mean, it's very rare that if you call that art, let's see, what would you call that? When ancient artists are depicting these things, it's unlikely that they were originally inspired. They very likely had something influencing them to make these. So perhaps the first artist or depictor of these things accidentally or intentionally had a psychedelic experience, witnessed these things, probably was horrified, depicted it in art. Those things have made it into scripture, but as new translations keep coming out, the definition of what these things are lessens and lessens.
Mm.
So if you look up what a satyr is in some of the newer translations, they just says a goat or maybe specifically a male goat. Very well could be that simple. But if you go back to the King James, um, and then even further beyond that, then it really starts getting back into mythology of things that it was shapeshifter, that these were not good people and or beings and stuff like that. And I just found it very interesting. And she thought it was so interesting that me as a Christian would consider these things and not just completely dismiss them and tell her
Yeah.
that she was full of it or crazy or something. She thought it was fascinating that someone who was opposite of her would be basically even accepting of these things. And so that definitely got me thinking a lot about how Christians could better reach people that have these experiences, not through the use of these psychedelics, because I definitely think those things should be reserved for death per se. And I can get to that a little bit more. And we ought to remember that the Bible mentions crazy, crazy things. There's mediums. Saul, the first king of Israel, was directly told by God not to go to a medium, and yet he did and conjured up a spirit. There's dragons mentioned. There's all these crazy images in the book of Revelation. Daniel, Genesis mentions, of course, the Nephilim. So it's not like these things are out of reach. These are within scripture, literally. So it's interesting to think about the role that they could have played, could be playing, what we're going to see in the afterlife. I don't know. All those thoughts
Yeah.
have been very fascinating lately.
Yeah, I would love to jump in and kind of ask a couple quick questions here. And well, I guess first I want to also make maybe a clarifying point or something, because I think, one of the things about Christianity is that there's a spiritual component to Christianity. And
Mm-hmm.
then you can have someone like that lady that you were working with that might not be a Christian, but is interested in the spiritual component. So that's like a common ground that you guys are able to like talk about, even though you operate through a religious framework and she maybe a secular pagan, who knows, or maybe just like agnostic, but just like interested in certain things or whatnot. And so that's cool that you guys can find common ground and like have a great conversation on that. But then as far as like, yeah, the psychedelics thing, being introduced into kind of like the spiritual or realm or spiritual things, um, I've kind of become aware of some of those theories of maybe that's why Moses saw the burning bush or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is because he
Right.
had accidentally eaten like a mushroom or something, like, or a fungus or something like that. And I think that I don't have very clear opinions on this, but I also think that there's something about like those drugs that I think can make you encounter spiritual things in a different way. Just because I think we're so routine oriented, we're not in touch with the spiritual world or really the natural world anymore. We're just kind of like doing our busy thing, and like I feel like so much of the world that we're just not uh you know connected with, and
Mm-hmm.
that I think that those things can be a good way to not not a good way, but those psychedelic drugs can connect you with the world or with the spiritual realm or whatever. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. I don't have much of an opinion on that. I don't know a lot about this stuff, but um yeah, I think it's interesting that you had said, and I kind of want to ask you about this, that that it should be reserved for death. Was that what you're saying? And could you maybe elaborate that point?
I don't have much to elaborate on, but and this is mentioned on, I think this line of thought got really famous from the Joe Rogan podcast, because obviously he's huge and he's had psychedelic users and scientists even on his podcast multiple times. They mention the psychedelic DMT. When you die, your brain has its own stores, and your brain floods all your neurons and your synapses, I guess, with DMT. If you were to take that, an endogenous or a exogenous form of it, now you would experience similar, probably you would experience similar death-like uh visions and seeing scenes, and you'd be hearing things and touching things that you wouldn't think were there, but now they are,
Jeez.
or whatever. And I looked that up, and that seems to be true. I mean, that seems to be a well agreed upon thing by most physicians and neurologists, that when you die, your brain releases all these chemicals that are the same, DMT, and you're like, what in the world? What do we do with that? Think of all the people that have had near death experiences. Actually, that's one of the things that the podcast you mentioned, he mentioned that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's that's something he probably experienced.
That's good to know, Pat, because I didn't. I figured there was something chemically going on with that guy's brain, but for the listener who doesn't know, I found this really interesting podcast with Joe. He did it recently. It was Joe, and I forget the guest's name now, but he was an atheist and was having a near death experience. Saw a void open up as he was in the hospital, and said, "You guys got to hurry, you're losing me," because he had lost so much blood due to an Oh gosh, an aneurysm. Yeah.
Aneurysm. Yep.
Yep. So he was losing a lot of blood. They're trying to save him. They have minutes, and he's seeing this void open up that he kind of knows isn't there. And then his father, who had been dead for a while, comes and he's like in the room, but not really, and is kind of like telling him to go on or like to come on to death, basically. And this man doesn't want to go with him at all, and knows that like his father being there is not a good sign. Like he's not happy to see him. He's not ready to die. He's only maybe like 50 years old. So um yeah, that was a really fascinating podcast. Just a great conversation between those two, but also being kind of surprised that this man was able to still hold an atheist worldview or standpoint after an experience like that is kind of profound. I mean, it's probably helpful to understand the brain chemistry and what was happening with the DMT and stuff, but I think some experiences are just very persuasive, or maybe too persuasive, and um, yeah, I was fascinated. He was still able to hold that standpoint after experiencing what he experienced, but again, that's the way I work, and everybody works differently or whatnot. But yeah, so I just wanted to kind of bring the listener in. I almost said the reader, the listener in with kind of what I had shared you guys, what was going on there.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I'm surprised too that he didn't even admit agnosticism, just full on kept going with atheism, which is yeah, interesting. But
And I think he tried to define his reasoning, um, which I wasn't super familiar with, but it was something along the lines of he respects religion too much to say that he would be agnostic, because that would acknowledge God, and then you would have to like be searching for the truth or for him or something. And I think his standpoint was more so, I just don't know, so I'm going to say I'm an atheist. Whereas I think most people would tend to say, I just don't know, so I'll say I'm agnostic, based on like if you grew up in a religious tradition but then you're not sure about what you believe. I think a lot of people would just say they're agnostic and they don't necessarily have a inclination one way or the other. But he kind of took a different approach, which was like, I don't really know, I'm not going to investigate it, and therefore like I'm, because like if there was a God in the universe, and or he did encounter him, like he couldn't help but know him. And since that hasn't happened, then he's an atheist, which you know I think I don't want to reject that point entirely, because um I think that there are people that feel that way. Like if there was a God, I would experience him or encounter him. Since I'm not experiencing or encountering him, there is no God. So it's like, I get that reasoning. It's not the train of thought that we come from. I see you want to say something. So
unfortunately, like I said over text, that is quite the exact reasoning a Calvinist would say he's an atheist.
oh yeah, do you mind explaining that? You had said that over text, but I'd love to get your thought.
So Calvinism would say God has predetermined all who will be his sheep and follow after him before time even began. So this man that we listen to, he's an atheist simply because God did not pick him. And he even mentioned that. He kind of similar to how you just referenced too. He said, well, you know how they say in religion, God finds you. Well, he obviously hasn't found me, so why would I believe he exists? That simple reasoning is the same as what Calvinists believe. Now, if we had a Calvinist here side by side, they'd be up in arms and they'd be crying, saying that's not at all what they believe. But unfortunately, they would just toe around and keep circling back, and it would in fact be what they would say. But
No,
I probably studied Calvinism for like 1,000 hours this last year. It's
really,
yeah, probably. Yeah. Trying to
wow.
understand it. I have done so much digging trying to understand the Calvinist perspective, and I cannot find it, nor do I understand it still, because I don't think it's biblical nor taught anywhere. I think they just pull 2 or 3 verses out of the Bible and run with it.
I think the predetermined predestination stuff is tough for me
It's tough. Yeah.
um, to defend, especially from the standpoint of like, so God is a God of order,
Hmm.
um, but yeah, the lack of free will, or the fact that, say, that guy from that podcast, like, he's not one of the elect or
Yeah, he's
elected, or
correct.
it's like,
Yep.
um I just don't like that idea that someone could outrightly, and I even hear the language I'm saying. I don't like that idea,
I was
but
gonna bring that up
yeah,
actually. Yep.
yeah. So I got to be careful, because I think, it's not that I don't like it, it's that it does not seem sound. To your point, it does not seem scriptural to me. Um, but yeah, I think that the Calvinist predetermined predestination, whatever you want to call it, that P in tulip, is would align with what that guy was saying, and he
Yeah.
just would happen to not be one of the elect or one of the chosen. Meanwhile, you and I could look at that same experience, that near death experience that he went through, and wonder, how is that not your sign from God, or
Right.
something like that.
Yeah.
Um, so, or how is, or maybe this. How is that not at least persuasive to you? Maybe it's not your sign from God, but how is that not at least persuasive?
Yeah. Great point. Great question. I'd say the same thing.
You got my mind going in this Calvinist direction now, Pat, because I think I'm not as well versed in the Armenian or Armenianism,
Yeah.
that sort of
Arminianism.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I know C.S. Lewis would have been an I can't even say it,
Yeah.
from the
He would have
Armenian
been.
school of thought or whatever.
Yep. Yep.
Um, and so obviously I think there are credible people within the Christian theological circles or whatnot that would prescribe to that belief. But also, we're out of our depth when it comes to this, potentially. And I know I had a guest on, who had gone through seminary, or maybe he actually might still be in seminary. I think he's actually graduated now. Um, Tyler Maddox Fry, if anyone feels led to look that up, or like they want to learn more about that theological conversation. But I don't remember if it was while we were recording or before after we recorded, but he does kind of mention he falls more in line with the Armenian thought as well. But I want to say, like, so the evangelical movement that we were kind of growing up in, or grew up in, that felt more like I think of the Young Restless Reform. If anyone's watched that Mars Hill podcast, it gets talked about a lot in there. And that's kind of when I was getting familiar with more of the language about what that movement was. But it was, I think, a lot of like Calvinist, Reformed theology kind of stuff. But
Hmm.
this is just, I feel like I'm out of my depth even saying those words.
You're not really though. You're really not. You've had education on it, plus you're a believer. Like you have experiences and thoughts and knowledge that pertains. I wouldn't say you're out of your element or depth at all.
Yeah, it's just I couldn't name you all the tulip, the letters
Oh,
that make up that acronym or
you don't
whatever.
have
So
to. They all
yeah,
eventually equate to the same thing. It could just be one in the end. I mean,
yeah.
there's I remember when we first encountered Calvinism, I think we were, or the name of it. Obviously, we encountered it, I'm sure, way earlier than what I'm
Yeah.
about to mention, but having a name to it, I think it was junior year because we actually read John Calvin's work in Mr. Bolser's English class, honors
Did we
English.
really?
We did, yeah.
Were
I
we in that
remember,
class together?
yeah, I think so. Yeah. Dude,
Shout
actually,
out Mr. Balzer.
I actually remember that class being bomb. Mr. Bolser is a real G. I love that guy. He was easily one of my favorite teachers. But uh yeah, so anyway, I remember encountering John Calvin's work then and there for the first time with the name. I definitely thought it was really interesting, but it wasn't obviously till much, much later that I sought to understand it. And then going to Laterno here in Texas, the Christian university, they hammer all aspects of Christianity, so Calvinism, Arminianism, Oh my gosh, you name it, they cover it, and it's really interesting. I asked my dad because he knows the theology department over there much better than I do if he knows of any hardcore 4 or 5 point Calvinists. He said he doesn't off the top of his head, and I don't think I had any professors that were either. But it's just really interesting how now that I'm looking it up all the time, I just see it everywhere. And unfortunately, it's such a big reason as to why, or it's used as an excuse as for why um deconstruction is such a big thing, really.
Really?
Yeah, yeah, real big.
So
So
oh,
go ahead, go
sorry.
ahead.
I was just gonna say, from what I understand about tulip, Calvinism, all that, total depravity.
Yep,
I get that one. I'm
me
on board
too.
with that. Utter
Yeah.
dependency. Yep. I'm with it. I'm tracking there. I don't remember what the L and the I stand for, but then with the predetermined predestination, whatever that one is, just while you're talking, it made me think of like the Old Testament. God's chosen people. Who were they? It was like Israel. And why then would why would Jesus's message then of the New Testament go out among the world, preach to the Gentiles, kind of, why would there be Acts? Why would that book be in the Bible? Or like who is predetermined then? Because you would assume it would be God's chosen people are the predetermined people, but
Mhm.
how far does that extend? Who should they, you would think there'd be more of a message or to like a direction of like go to these people or go, or are they just supposed to know if they hear it? Was it supposed to be Rome? Was it, like that's the part that I think I would have trouble with. Um yeah, or if like say um the remote person somewhere in Africa is supposed to be predetermined, but they don't hear the word, they never accept Christ, anything like that, and they die, what happens, and obviously I don't like getting into all that stuff. I don't like because God is the judge and I don't like playing that game, but it is like as far as this conversation is concerned, I think it is a legitimate point of I yeah, I don't know. I think there's real challenges with that last point of Calvinism.
Just the last one.
Well, I don't know. I don't remember what the third and the fourth, the L and the I don't remember what those stand for. The first two I accept fully. Um,
The L is limited atonement, and then the I is irresistible grace.
well, those sound good. What do they mean?
So limited atonement quite literally means Jesus did not die for everyone. He only died for the elect.
Oh,
And then the um oh my gosh, irresistible grace. Another way is that it's only irresistible for those who have been called, pretty much. You can only experience it if you've been called. And once you know you've been called and you have been called, you literally have no other choice. You can't deny it, in other words. So when you feel the pull of God's grace, it's yours whether you like it or not, whether you want it or not. You actually do not have the choice, which gives the excuse to live however exactly you want now, by the way.
I actually have a book idea about this,
Ooh.
which we can talk more afterwards. But I didn't know. I wasn't thinking necessarily about the I and tulip of the 5 points of Calvinism for the reasoning, but it was kind of more of like the Calvinist idea in general. I just kind of had this idea. I'll share with you afterwards, but listener, sorry, it's not going to get shared with you because it's not a full-fledged idea. I don't want to parade it out too soon and it be a flop or something. But it is a book I've kind of been intrigued about writing. But yeah, no, I think that the limited atonement, when I hear that, I thought it would have meant I only have one option to be atoned, which is Jesus. I wasn't thinking Jesus performed this sacrifice to atone a certain amount of people. I was thinking about it
Uh,
from the opposite lens. that's why I was like, oh, that seems like it makes sense. But then when you explained it, I'm like, again, I think it's those last three feel like they kind of roll up together a
Pretty
little bit.
much. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I would say so.
Um, but I can almost hear the voice of our friend Austin chiming in at this point saying,
We need Austin for this one.
just love God, just love people. It's
And
not
he's
that hard,
right.
you know. And he's
Yeah,
right.
he's
And he's
right.
right. Yeah.
Yep.
And so Austin, wherever you are in the world, we love you and are thinking of you.
Absolutely
But
are.
yeah, that's when, like, I feel like there are certain situations I can be in and I can hear Austin's voice, or I can, if it's like you were saying Proverbs early, I always think of you with like a short but practical, wise application for, for something. And it's like I can hear what you guys might say if I'm in a certain situation. I think that's a mark of a good friend, that you guys, sharpen me in that way.
Mm,
But
absolutely.
but yeah, I think it is, like, it's certainly fun to talk about. It's an interesting intellectual exercise to talk about this stuff. But I also think, yeah, it shouldn't get in the way of someone making decisions about their lives, wondering about if they've experienced God and if they're elect or not elect or whatever. It's just like, I just, I just don't want anyone to get hung up on that if they are out there listening to this. And, yeah, it's like, outlined pretty simply by Jesus. The way the truth and life is through him, and you have the choice to accept that. And that's my interpretation or my hermeneutics or whatever, from the scripture. But
And the reason it's become such a big deal to me lately, I would say this year I really went pretty ham digging in it. I guess when I go to church down here at Southern Baptist Church, this is a lot of the language that the congregation uses. So whether they would call themselves Calvinists or not, somewhat is irrelevant, but they would still use these thoughts and ideas in the way they, quote unquote, witness and minister to people. And I've seen it a few times, and unfortunately, it's pretty condemning and unloving to, granted, justly tell someone they're a sinner, but not know whether they're the called or not, and then more than likely condemn them to hell because they're probably not the called. And I don't know, just having seen it a lot is why I put a lot of focus and attention on it. But
yeah,
it's just damaging. It seems to be damaging to the Christian faith.
yeah, it's a good point about the verbiage too. Like the called, it implies that there's a select
Mm-hmm.
number. Um, and that's when it gets into the odd part too, because it's like, yes, there are a select, like, we can count, not that this is entirely accurate, but we could do a survey or something. We could get a sample size of all the Christians in the world. So there is like a number or something like that, but that doesn't mean that, like, that number couldn't be changed, right? Or like,
Right.
if it's 7 billion, well, it could be 7 billion and one, because this person in Spain decided to give their life to Christ or something like that. And yeah, that's where it's like, where is that line of, and maybe we have to have another guest on to kind of help elaborate some of this. But it's like, where is that line of, this is this predetermined thing, and then where's the line of, like, we have the agency to change the course of our future or something like that. Because I don't like the idea of, like, everything being predetermined in our lives. Like, so, if our salvation or something's predetermined, how much of everything that we do is predetermined? And like, and if we find comfort in that, why do we find comfort in that? Like, I love, like, idealism. I love individualism, liberalism, the self, and the agency, autonomy, that sort of thing. So that would be tough for me to accept that, oh, everything in my life is actually predetermined. There's not anything, even if I yell at God and I curse at God, like that was there's no free will or something. Well, actually, I don't think a Calvinist would argue that we don't have free will, but I
If they're real Calvinists, they would.
really,
There's a sect of Calvinism called hyper Calvinism, which is just those who stick to the 5 points, the tulip. And if they're honest, they will admit free will does not exist.
huh? See, that one's also tricky for me too, because then why create us? If
You'll
you're
have a
God,
if you went to YouTube right now and you just looked up like YouTube shorts on Calvinists or tried to watch some Calvinistic Calvinistic YouTubers or pastors, they will dodge and bounce around that question a lot. They won't give you a straight answer, yes or no, as to whether they believe we have free will or not. And that is very telling, the fact that they can't say yes or no. There's only a few, very few that I've encountered online that have said no free will, period.
hmm,
That God does quite literally everything, evil and good, the
wow.
yin and the yang. Yeah.
Is this something that you're maybe talking with the person? I'm thinking now back to you at your job and this lady that it was precept, right? That you were
Yeah, I was
pre-
precepting her.
precepting
Yeah,
her,
teaching her, pretty much just
teaching
teaching
her.
her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is this something that you guys are talking about as well, or would that be too like specific to Christianity to like talk about with her?
I mentioned it actually. I brought it up and
Okay.
she was aware of what it was, which is interesting because usually you'd think it's kind of an in-house debate between
Yeah. Yeah.
Christians, but she was actually appalled at the idea of it. Yet, which this is so interesting. Yet the way she talks would make me think if she were a Christian, she would be a Calvinist, though, which is kind of funny.
What can I ask what you mean by that?
So when she was telling me about some of her life-changing experiences with the psychedelic drugs, her perspective and belief is that God is all of us and we are all God. So there is no one God. There's infinite gods, and yet there's also one. We are the infinite gods and we are the one God. So the way in which we live is just all the gods in and through us, and we don't really choose what we want to do. We just react as they lead us, pretty much.
Oh, I
It's
was
dumb,
I was
but
tempted to say that that's just a nice way of saying there is no God, but then that last part you're saying about they're basically manipulating us to act.
yeah.
That's
Mhm.
unsettling.
It's kind of like the
Seems
simulation theory too. It goes along with that in a way.
okay. I think I have a trouble. I would reject most of those kind of like authoritarian kind of things, um, with where it's like there's this entity controlling what it is we do. I think I just have trouble with that narrative, and that might be my own bias. I think, um, but yeah, that would be and very interesting to sit down and have a conversation with someone from with that perspective. But yeah, I think it would probably be trouble. It would be hard to find a common ground. In a
Yeah, it would
conversation like
be.
that. Yeah,
It definitely would be. I would love to do it too, though, because I want to know what I'm missing really bad.
missing and like understanding.
Yeah, yeah, because I'm serious. Plenty of hours I have devoted to trying to see what it is. And I want them to convince me so bad. That's how hard I've been going looking at these things. Like, please just let this one person's explanation be good. Let it convince me. Blah 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 blah. It
Yeah,
just so actually, you know what? Something I could ask them is, since I've done so much looking and quote unquote seeking, as they may say, and I'm still unconvinced. Am I not called?
yeah.
Even though I wholeheartedly believe Jesus is God and died and rose again, and that He's Lord and that He's God. but I'm
Yeah.
absolutely not a Calvinist.
Wow. Yeah, I don't know where I fall on all that. But I'd love to have more discussions and, think about it, I think, more. I wouldn't claim to be anything of those
Same, I
the
wouldn't
way I
either.
stand. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, because it's like I can only I can only bear to throw on so many identities. Christian is fine enough. I don't need to like even the denominations. I have trouble saying like I am this denomination or something like that. And
Right.
obviously there are probably some that I wouldn't associate with. Like I think of Western Baptists as being like a strict and having a lot of odd stuff in their history from what I can recall. But
Yep.
so I wouldn't like obviously want to associate that. But I grew up Catholic, and you know, I think in high school I really rejected Catholicism, but now I do think that there are people that legitimately practice Catholicism and like worship God in doing that. And it's not the way I would do that, but I'm also like because I've kind of been through that and know people that are that faith, like totally think that's legitimate. And and that's I think a lot of Protestant. There's still that kind of Catholic Protestant tension, but I really see value in both of those now. But maybe that's a conversation for a whole other day.
I would love to have that conversation. Absolutely.
Because yeah, I think that once you start getting into religion, whether Christianity or anything else, I feel like there's just kind of infinite things you can really talk about within that. So encompassing.
I definitely think there is a lot of value in knowing what we're talking about, though, because it is difficult those to reach the lost, the unbelieving, if we aren't able to distinguish between the sectors of Christianity, pretty much. I would agree. I mean, I think you and I and Austin, we would not identify with one or the other. We would say, hopefully I can speak for Austin. I mean, he's Austin's here on these topics. We're down here for sure, but I think Austin would definitely say, just follow Jesus. What does Jesus say?
Yeah,
Let's go love. Yeah, and that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
it
And
is
that's what we're
funny.
that's what we're gonna do. But the
The,
non-believer, they have questions. They want to know why. They want to know why.
yeah,
Really.
and I think like the smart, not even the smartest, but the well, they know the most about theology. They love God, have all that kind of stuff going for them. I think most of the responses that is like, I know about all the Arminianism, I know about all the Calvinism, but I don't get lost in that. Like I'm focused on the simple message of the gospel, and
Yeah,
and I think
beautiful.
that's a good takeaway, or like kind of like wrap up that discussion. I think that's
Yeah,
a good
perfect. Yep.
yeah. But I also think because this is more of a philosophical podcast, I think this is kind of a good space for us to discuss these things. And I hope we have more of these conversations. But I also want, disclaimer for the listener, if you are kind of having interest in Christianity or you're not sure about any of that kind of stuff, don't let anything that we've said about Calvinism or any of that like sway you. The
Yep.
mess the message is
Agreed.
simple. Love Jesus, love people. I think that's a pretty good truth to live by. So
Absolutely. Couldn't say it any better.
yeah. I feel like I had one other thing to ask you. Now it's escaping me. Um but man, I think we've covered a lot. Was there anything else on your mind, Pat?
Oh, I'm sure there is, but now I'm focused on one thing, so it'll have to wait probably.
Is that one thing dinner or something or
Calvinism.
okay.
I'm probably gonna go watch a video on it here shortly.
Oh,
But
awesome. Yeah. Yeah, I would love to keep that conversation going, and I think that we've tackled it quite a bit here today, but yeah, this is one of those conversations that you alluded to earlier, where this is Austin's wheelhouse, like as far as
yep.
like that as far as the three hosts on the podcast, this is really his powerhouse or whatnot. So
Yeah, I
um,
can't wait. I can't wait to get his thoughts on these things.
I know, man, I know. Well, Pat, in the meantime, in between time, it was great having you on. Thank you again for having this discussion with me today. And yeah, let's do it again soon.
Sounds good to me. I love you, bro.
Love you too. Peace, everyone.